Um, and there we have the notification it's being recorded. So our speaker today is Nathan Fineman. Nathan is a managing director at DuCharme, McMillen Associates Incorporated. He has 15 plus years of experience in property tax assessment, appraisal, management, and consulting. With more than 10 years specific to property tax and an additional 6 years specializing in appraisal, valuation, and review, he brings a deep understanding of complex valuation processes and alternate solutions. Nathan specializes in personal property taxation, valuation, and forecasting for complex assets across the U.S., serving clients in the data center, chemical, manufacturing, pulp and paper, food and beverage, pharmaceutical, and other industrial sectors. Nathan holds a BA in economics and political science, as well as a business management certification from Indiana University in Bloomington. Please help me welcome Nathan to our Lunch and Learn.
Great. Thank you so much, Penny. I really appreciate it. And thank you all so much for joining and inviting me here today. I really want to spend some time. Our main focus is going to be around is what is a data center? How does it impact taxation? What are some of the factors that we need to be looking into? But as part of that, a lot of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis on both the taxation and incentive side is understanding what's going on in the local communities. And that can be anything from what's going on with the local social scene and how people are reacting and responding to data centers potentially being brought into their area and the factors and everything that goes along with that. But it can also just be additional just pushback against this new type of facility just due to unknown misinformation, a lot of lacking details that are out there. So what we like to do is just be able to go through and try and help everyone understand from our perspective the benefits that there are for data centers going into local jurisdictions on the taxation basis, and some of the things just to look out for so that your community doesn't have any negative impacts. What we've been seeing a lot in the US recently is that companies have even been giving back incentives, not building out the additional phases of their development like they were thinking they would, and doing a lot of other reactionary things based on pushback from local communities. And so what that impacts down the road is the tax amounts and the revenues for your budgets that are expected to come into the communities. So everything that we're going to go through today, starting with what a data center is, and then getting to how does it impact you, is what we're seeing a lot in the US and emerging markets and how it theoretically could impact Alberta as we move forward with additional developments. So starting out today, one of the main things that I always like to cover, just so that everyone's aware, is the different aspects of a data center. And things have really changed over time. There's a lot more complex areas. You have everything from enterprise facilities, which are just single tenant owner occupied, co-location facilities with multiple tenants operating under another owner operator. And then you have hyperscale facilities that get into the multi-billion-dollar investment range. And with all of that, there's been a lot of changes in technology, both the heating, cooling, electric, everything that's going inside what you're seeing in this diagram right now is changing on a regular basis. GPUs, which are the graphic processing units that are processing all this data within data centers, typically have about a 12 to 18 month IT economic obsolescence cycle. So every 12 to 18 months, a new generation of this equipment is being brought in. And along with that, all of this additional infrastructure that you see is going to be adapted to work with this new type of equipment. Some of the things that we've seen with the air conditioning, for example, is new humidification levels are necessary in order for the equipment to maintain within the facility. And because of that, it's directly operational critical for the facility to operate with that humidification equipment. A lot's been done just to find a way to adjust by 5 to 10% humidity so that the optimization of the GPUs can be running what the tenant assumes would work. There's a lot of other issues that we deal with cooling units. And the main thing that I do like to look at here, though, as well, and we'll get into more later, is just the interconnectivity overall of how all of this equipment fits into the facility. Because a big part of what we'll talk about is the bifurcation between real and personal property and how it needs to be treated. The reason I was going through all of the advancements on the technological side is those tech advancements directly have an impact on the equipment that's very much integrated into the facility that you see here. And as that progresses over time, we're not expecting a 15, 30, 50-year life on a lot of these building and infrastructure assets. But a lot of the engineering folks that we talk to, it's more in the 8 to 12 range. So because of that, we really need to be paying a lot of attention to what's going on and the interconnectivity of these assets and how they're being treated between real and personal property. Then we look at why are companies moving into a certain area and where are they going? This is going to be number one. The number one list on here is power. Everything is really coming down to power. Even though we're going to be talking about taxation a little bit today, companies are still very focused on the power aspect, and that's going to be the number one driver of why they're moving into communities. That's not too much of a secret. That's the one thing that comes up quite often on all of this pushback from communities, that the issue of the data center moving in is going to depress the power requirements and the availability for other residents in the area. So that's, of course, a very hot topic, but jurisdictions have to understand that there's certain hot pockets of this power that's out there, and you'll have data center companies that are willing to move and spend significant amount of money just to retain that power. Fiber connectivity, luckily in Alberta, is already very strong, so you're in a good shape there. Another aspect that's necessary, though, is you need to be able to connect to the main system, to the grid. The land availability, that's even more crucial now based on the way that some of these facilities are being built out for energy requirements and really just to save a lot of additional capital expenditure. You will build out significantly more on the land versus building on top of a building and having a better structure that has a lower insurable value. What they're trying to do is be a lot more efficient in these areas, and by doing so, they actually end up using more land at times. The workforce access is extremely important throughout actually the life cycle of the data center, not just the initial construction. So we'll talk about that a little bit more so, but there are skilled labor that are needed, and that is something that typically gets overlooked as we're talking about the data center facilities. And then, of course, the business climate. You want to make sure that you're an attractive and competitive tax environment with stable and predictable metrics that data center companies are going to be able to model everything out on. With uncertainty and ambiguity, it opens up the door for a lot of fluctuations, a lot of levers that can be moved by tax consultants and folks that come in to adjust or depress certain value aspects, moving more to personal versus real, depending on the situation or vice versa. So it's really helpful to eliminate all of that ambiguity, which we'll discuss here a little bit more so as well. A data center investment has significantly ballooned. And we're talking about when you're looking at these hyperscale facilities, this is an example at the top here where a 500 megawatt facility nowadays could be at least a $20 billion investment. Over 45 to 55% of that is going to be directly tied to IT and compute with the additional support assets around there, which leaves only about 30% or so, once you account for ancillary equipment, that's going to be related to the building and the support infrastructure in order for that data center to be able to operate with its electrical and power cooling requirements. So by looking at that, that's a significant amount of investment that's going in. But when you look at Alberta specifically, those IT and compute costs aren't really going to be accounted for there. So what I try to do is a simple breakdown, just looking at more of a 40 megawatt facility, which would typically be around $500 million. We typically use a range of about $10 to $15 million per megawatt in USD in order to be able to understand what the typical build would be and account for regional factors. So the typical range for a 40 megawatt facility of total IT compute capacity would be right around that $500 million figure. Now, when you look at that, the land, relatively cheap as far as the overall project consideration is concerned. The building and structure, it's a significant portion. But when you look at the servers and the computing equipment, that's where the real expenditures and the real money is coming into play these days. The units that used to be used for crypto mining and a lot of those other operations, those are more on the CPU side, processing things through really quickly, very short-lived assets. They would burn them out and not worry about maintaining the equipment. Now you're talking about millions to multi-million dollar per unit GPU investments that they want to make sure that they're maintaining and keeping in good condition. So the power and cooling infrastructure and some of the server and compute expenditures that you see up here, those are all going to fall more so on that personal property side, which leaves very little left to be taxed from the municipality. Taking into consideration, which we'll go into a little bit more so here, is the levy that's in place, which is a great step in a certain direction, but that can be offset once a company starts lifting up the amount of income that they're generating from the facility. And that's at the provincial level. That's not going to be at your local municipality. One thing that I wanted to also talk about here is the overall data center life cycle. And it starts with site selection, but it never really ends. We go all the way through the process here to expansion. And the community benefits are what I'd like to highlight here, because a lot of times it's overlooked as to what the benefits are to the local community as far as infrastructure, local jobs, stable taxation, reinvestment in that area, and then economic growth for the supporting infrastructure and businesses that are around it. So it's not the full on sell of why the data center should be put there. But when you look at the infrastructure, the investment is typically going to come via the data center company, the owner operator, or the developer of the land. They're the ones that are going to be paying for a lot of the interconnectivity. They're the ones that are going to be working to increase the efficiency and the reliability of the grid. They're the ones that are going to make sure that the sewer systems are working correctly and that the roads have access to a lot of the different facilities. So all of this additional benefit from the infrastructure is on top of this perceived taxation that may come through. So you are winning in a lot of these different areas that are sometimes overlooked. Local jobs, and we see this in literature all the time, that there's not going to be high skilled workers on site. It's going to be a very limited construction phase, and then they move on. In actuality, there are very high skilled engineering folks that are on site for the life cycle of these assets. And typically with the data center, you're going to build out potentially a 10 pod unit. You have an entire campus, and on that campus, you might end up with 10 buildings that could be that 500 megawatts that I was referencing earlier. However, you're not going to be building out all 500 megawatts on day one. You start with one building and then move to two, and then phase the development over time. So what that does is it keeps those jobs on the books effectively throughout the entire life cycle of that construction build. But when that's done, there's still a lot of things that need to be improved and maintained, because now you've gone 5 to 7 to 10 years down the road to complete all of these investments in the development. And now you need the folks there to maintain the infrastructure and make sure that it's all accounted for in the right way. The stable taxes, which I talked about, are a huge benefit not only to the taxpayer, but to the jurisdiction as well. You don't have to deal as much with compute in Alberta, which we deal with a lot in the US. And those are heavy depreciable assets. So all of a sudden, a company might be paying $500 million on that $20 billion investment in year one. But since so much of that is heavily tied to the compute, that depreciates very quickly and falls off the books. Now, this can happen here as well, because a lot of arguments in Alberta could be made theoretically to account for a lot lower life for those infrastructure assets I was talking about, due to the rapid changes in technology, the new infrastructure that would be needed to support them, and a lot of other factors. So stabilizing taxes and not having these ebbs and flows when new investment comes in and then it depreciates down are going to be very beneficial to the project long term, which is then going to cause these companies to reinvest and want to be in the jurisdiction longer, which leads to further economic growth down the line. So we like to highlight these because a lot of times it's just generally overlooked, and it seems to a lot of folks and residents in the communities, as well as those in our assessing community, that you're only going to have this influx of revenue and expenditure and jobs for a short period of time. But in actuality, the community benefits extend far beyond that. These are essentially the key themes that we come across every time they're running through a project lifecycle on a data center. We go from the site selection and power strategy, which is, again, like I said, that number one area that we need to be focusing on for data center site selection, to pick a prime site and know that you can actually operate there. You need to know that you're going to be able to scale and phase the expansion so you can continue to grow over time. But then there's also a lot of construction and supply chain issues that we run into, which can lead to a lot of construction delays, which actually has a pretty interesting impact on taxation overall. We run into a lot of jurisdictions here in the US that tell us, well, we were expecting so much more revenue from this data center faster than it happened. What's going on here? Construction delays, and they're trying to then tax assets that don't even exist yet, that haven't been fully constructed. That is the problem with expectations on revenue and trying to meet budgets and not forecasting and having stable taxes out the correct way. So we spend a lot of time working with local jurisdictions as well as our clients to make sure that we understand those supply chain issues and layer those into our forecasting so that everyone's on the same page, knowing what local revenue they should be expecting from the valuation and taxation. And then the ever-evolving demands of hyperscalers, they keep talking and keep wanting to grow. So All of these build to suit and very specific buildings keep growing in size and functionality. They're being built for flex operations, different kinds of cooling and heating. And what that's really leading to is significant construction delays, but also significantly overbuilt assets that may not need to be there in any way, actually. And why data centers don't behave like their industrial properties that are around there. You can easily look at something like a cold storage facility, or biopharma is another one that we look at that is a pretty good comparable. You have a lot of HEPA filters, clean rooms, a lot of air handling, a lot of additional electrical equipment that might be going into these facilities. But those are only slight comparables, and there's so much more that's interconnected, and it's a lot more ambiguous when you're looking at a data center property. What ends up happening a lot of times is the cost-based methodology is not going to align with market reality. And that has a lot of factors that come into play. But for an example, if you're building a $2 million data center, and we recently dealt with this with a client of ours, the construction company went to the jurisdiction before the project was announced, trying to work through incentives and potential options, and told them we're going to invest $2 billion and it's going to be a $2 billion data center. The problem with that is there's intangibles, there's entrepreneurial profit, there's a lot of other factors that come into play here that aren't going to be reflective in the market value. So your cost approach could have a significant over accounting of what the value for that facility would be. These facilities are also very complex and special use. Again, luckily, the technology side isn't as impactful, but as again, that continues to change, a lot of these other refreshes are going to occur along with the infrastructure assets, which makes them even more modular, takes more expenditure away from the real estate, and is putting them into non-accessible machinery and equipment in Alberta. So a lot of these things really do have an impact, and that's why we look through the cost, market, and income approaches when we're looking at all of these facility types to ensure that we're accounting for any extraneous variables that might be leading to an overvaluation. The reason these are so difficult is because there's not even just one type of data center. Like I mentioned earlier, you have the owner-occupied, you have the co-location with multiple companies that are coming on site, and then you have that hyperscale, which is going to be more of your AI factory or cloud computing. But within that, you have different setups, the different construction general contractor companies will be able to establish for you. And jurisdictions in the US, and I believe it to be so with the current structure that we've seen in Alberta, what's going to occur here is a significant differentiation between a turnkey and a powered shell. In a turnkey data center, things are even more convoluted because the operator and the developer of that property is really going to install all of this equipment that you see. The MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, the IT-ready environment, all of that's going to be done by them, and a lot of times potentially just sit on their books with a real estate pass-through and an additional tax associated with leasing the space out. It makes it even more difficult because we don't get to see those records at times, especially when we're working with the tenant, and we don't know exactly what was included in the owner-operator side versus the tenant within the data hall. It's important to also then look at the powered shell, which is really just going to be more or less a warehouse with some basic power connectivity. And a lot of times what we do, depending on the certain jurisdiction we're working in, is we have to very clearly define which one that we're talking about. Because if it's being valued as a turnkey data center, that would assume that all of the power infrastructure, all of the electrical, and everything that went into that build would be accessible on the real estate side because it's a fully integrated unit. On a powered shell, however, you're really just looking more at the land, the concrete, and some basic building improvements for electrical to get it ready for a data center to move in. And then the tenant would move in and bring all of this additional equipment with them, making it much more movable, much more modular, and fit much more on that machinery and equipment side. So not even just the type of facility, but the basis of valuation of what you're calling the data center can have a material impact on the overall valuation and potentially duplicative taxation when you're bringing in too much additional cost. In Alberta, it can specifically lead to overtaxation and overvaluation because you'd be bringing in a significant amount of technical machinery and equipment, but it's just subsumed within the real estate value. We deal with this all the time where we have real property in one jurisdiction and personal property in another, but it's the exact same asset. We run into this with generators where we can go from one state to another right next door in the US, and they're treated completely different. So this is just an example of some of the assets with generators, air compressors, switch gears, all of this equipment that theoretically could be building support, But at the same time, is it only there for the intent of the data center and only there for that specific purpose? So we get into a lot of conversations with this MEP and how to properly allocate it based on its use, based on its intent, and really based on how the owner operator established everything to begin with. One of the things that we're also seeing, and it relates directly to what I was just talking about how to view assets between real and personal property, is that we're seeing established markets shifting their approach now when a certain state like Wisconsin, just up north of us here, I'm in Indiana currently, they eliminate the personal property tax and then they change their approach entirely to assess everything as real estate. Emerging markets that we're dealing with that don't have much data center activity, or they had a lot of crypto and some smaller enterprise locations very similar to Alberta, are now working with very limited data and really no precedents in place to be able to actually establish what should be done and a base guideline for what and how data centers should be valued as, which leads directly to aggressive assessment tactics, because when there's any type of ambiguity out there, a lot of folks latch onto that and they're going to pick both on the assessment and the consulting side to mitigate tax whatever's going to be most advantageous to them. But the most important thing, what we really need to come down to is we have to coordinate on those tax strategies, because at the end of the day, the data center wants to be a good tenant within the jurisdiction. The jurisdiction wants to be a good tax partner. They want to be able to take that revenue in and foster development in the jurisdiction. They don't want to be pushing the taxpayer away. So that's why we work very heavily with our credits and incentives groups to make sure that we're understanding the incentives in play and getting everything kind of aligned to work together, so that you're not getting $100 million in tax one year and then 3 years later it's dropping down to 40 million or less. We want to be able to stabilize that, and incentives, that can be a very good way about going about that. And data centers in Alberta, and why this is all kind of important here, is that they're taxed in two main ways, where you get the land and the building, and that's going to be at the municipal level. Everything else on the machinery and equipment side we discuss is going to be exempt as your typical industrial properties. But then that IT aspect, it goes to the side and you're not able to assess that. So it really depresses the potential benefit and the amount of value you'd be able to derive from the facility. So making sure that everyone's on the same page to maximize that benefit and make sure that the benefit is there for both the taxpayer and jurisdiction is extremely important. So this is going to what I was talking about earlier with the misinformation we deal with. And this is a common issue that we would more or less confront in every jurisdiction that we step into. Some are even starting to do moratoriums on data center builds because they're getting so much of this pushback from local groups that are focused on one specific aspect or potentially all of this. So, of course, the energy costs, that's the number one thing, again, that all residents are worried that if a data center moves in, their power is not going to work anymore. They're going to have rolling blackouts, or the cost is going to increase significantly for the same service they were having before. Most of the time, this isn't the case. This 279% increase example, that's from one study that was done. And a lot of times this misinformation comes from just one study or one group that then trickles down, and they're using that as the base example for all data centers. It leads to just a lot of general misinformation, and we try to spend a lot of time helping the communities understand exactly what the benefits are versus all of the negative impacts that are perceived. Another one that came up is very interesting is heat islands. That an Oxford University study that has not even been peer reviewed yet said that you could increase the temperature of a plot of land by 2 to 9 degrees Celsius just by putting a data center in there. And then that would be for the surrounding area as well. There's really been no information to support that, and no one's proved out that a data center is going to magically generate and radiate significant amount of heat that would be detrimental to the surrounding area. Water usage was a big one, and it still gets published a lot. I was very happy to see in some literature that was provided to me specific to Alberta is that you are recognizing the technological shifts, and that most of the data centers now, when you're going up to about 100 megawatts of power, they're really only using about 10 to 20 typical households of water on an annualized basis. So a data center is operating the same as less than 10 houses roughly in your neighborhood. So the water usage has significantly gone down, and so has the pollution. Without using evaporative cooling, but actually using chilled water cycles and retaining all that water in the system, there's much less of a need for pollution on the water side. There's no retention ponds, basins, anything like that. There's also really no air pollution that's coming out of that because the generators are only there in backup function, and most power should be drawn from the grid or renewable energy sources. Only about a few minutes a year, and really in emergency situations, is when those generators are going to kick on. Data centers don't create jobs. They actually do, as I mentioned earlier, and it's a lot of high-paying engineering jobs, especially when you layer in incentives that require those high-paying jobs. Then you're securing that workforce for the future as well. And that incentives lose money, they typically don't to an extent. It's a negotiation to stabilize that revenue. And it works out better for everyone because when you set a budget and you're understanding what revenue is coming in, to my point earlier, you want to be able to have that to be predictable. You don't want to be sitting in a situation where you set a budget for your jurisdiction and then the revenue significantly cliffs at the 5 or 7 year mark and it was not expected. So this is the reality to confront a lot of these untruths, if you will. It's a lot of the story that hasn't been told. That many studies are flawed. It's very true. Many narratives are out of date. Absolutely true. We're focusing on data centers that were even 5 to 7 years ago, significantly out of date compared to what's being constructed today. Site specific and efficient. They're using a lot more internal power. They're using a lot more closed loop systems to keep that all in. Modern facilities as industrial manufacturing and everything has grown in this area. So have data centers, and they're utilizing that technology. The job creation impact is real. And I've been on site speaking to a lot of these folks that have had their life changed with very high paying jobs on the engineering front just because a data center wanted to move into their area. And then the revenue boom that is associated with that is material. And you're going to be able to, even without the IT, have very significant investments in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars that could be accessible theoretically as real estate, depending on how everything's treated, that will bring a lot of additional dollars into the jurisdiction. So there are massive investments, but also the infrastructure demands that are out there. And there are some utility constraints. There are resource impacts. There are some of those things that are going to occur as construction is ongoing and everything is being put to into the site and everything's being constructed out. But that's for a short period of time on the more invasive scale. And then the long-term investment on the data center is going to be significantly quieter and really a lot better of a situation, I think, than what you would see with an industrial manufacturing facility being placed in your backyard. So the cities want to grow, or jurisdictions want to grow, municipalities want to grow, but you want it to be fair as well. You have the pushback from the residents and you want to treat them fairly. You have these data center companies moving in and you don't want to be gouging them and treating their properties inequitably. So we have to create that balance. And with the rise of AI infrastructure and these significantly large builds that are coming out, we even about a year ago were talking a few hundred megawatts and now we're into the multi-gigawatt range. So if what I've heard at conferences recently, Canada is just a little bit behind and catching up with some of the post-COVID construction and a lot of other things going on. But a lot of these developments, and I can tell from a lot of our clients' exploration and forecasting and due diligence work we've been doing, they are looking to move north of the border, move out of the US and establish a lot more presence there. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the specific to Alberta tax impacts and the new levy that was put in place. What we've kind of found, and I spoke at a CPTA event earlier this year, is that the parameters around it are still a little bit confusing. The 75 megawatt benchmark is still not 100% defined and set as to whether or not it's the full megawatt load for the facility or more the IT load that can be used. So the one thing I didn't mention is when you have a facility, you have to have power to operate all of the air handlers, power distribution, generator backup equipment, and the facility overall. So if you have a 100 megawatt site, typically only 75 to 80 of that is usable for the IT. Understanding how that all interplays is going to have a big impact on how the Alberta framework and these megawatt treatments are applied to certain data centers. The compute levy definitely is segregated those out, but I think it took some of the ambiguity away, and it's definitely going to lead to front-end investment until the income from these companies can catch up. So there is going to be a benefit there, but again, much more on the provincial level instead of the municipality, which can become an issue. And at a certain point, once income eclipses that 2% amount of the gross expenditures they've put on site, that essentially goes away and they're paying the typical income tax again. So it's a very limited benefit in that sense, unless something is worked around in order to be able to counteract that. However, There are a lot of benefits to this. I see Alberta getting way ahead of a lot of the jurisdictions that we've been dealing with. The education that's been out there, the assessing community that I've been speaking with over the past 9 months or so really starts to understand, and they've been asking a lot of very good questions about these exact things. What about if it's not connected to the grid? How is it treated there? How about if we supply certain amounts of power versus taking the full 75 megawatts from the grid? And that behind the fence or behind the meter power, as they call it, that can have a really big impact on how these facilities are treated and who ends up actually valuing them. On the provincial level, as an industrial property, or do they stay with the municipality? And there's a lot of metrics that can influence this. So when we look at Alberta specifically, we want to be able to look at the power infrastructure and planning. There's a lot in place there. The assessment framework has started out. You have a very good set of general rules and guidelines that just need to be refined a little bit more to create less ambiguity and really understand how these assets are going to be valued. So in going via the cost of market approach, we really understand what's included in some of these overall valuations. And the one interesting thing that I think about the way that Alberta is structuring this a lot right now is you're really encouraging a lot of the data center owner operators and development companies to bring their own power. Alberta is a great source of natural gas, and you have a lot of oil. There's a lot of additional power infrastructure up there. But with a company bringing in a lot of that other infrastructure themselves and doing more behind the meter, it really has even less of an impact on the community overall. It may have a slight impact on the amount of taxation captured via that, but that all comes back to how we treat these facilities on the 75 megawatt basis and what can become accessible and where. The main goal overall, though, is just to make sure that everything is brought back together and the community has all of these considerations in mind. These are things that the data centers are talking about, and these are the things that we believe are really helpful, just the main hit points for jurisdictions to understand from the data center operator's perspective as to what they're thinking about as they look to build and grow into new and emerging markets. So one thing that we like to always just end on is just making sure that we convey it's kind of more of a teamwork thing. We find a lot of time in the assessment community that consultants and assessors, auditors, we have a lot of differences of opinions. But when these data centers have come online and the significant investment that we're seeing and the annualized potential tax revenue from them has grown so significantly beyond any other industry we've seen in recent memory, it becomes very necessary to essentially work together. If we can eliminate a lot of that ambiguity, we can eliminate a lot of these court decisions, a lot of tax commission issues that we run into, and try and create some uniformity where everyone's on the same page and understands how these assets are being valued. So I know we covered a lot today. I'm sure there's a lot of questions because we do have to essentially hop all the way from what makes up a data center to why they are in certain places and then all of the other impacts that influence the value overall. So happy to answer any questions, Penny, if anything did come through there. I'm a little bit more on the property tax side here in the US. So if there are some more incentive related questions, I may defer to some of my colleagues and follow up, but happy to try and get through a few here.
Thank you, Nathan. That was a lot to absorb, so I'm sure there are some questions. I don't see any in the chat at the moment. So people in the participant list can either type them into the group chat or using the react button, they can raise their hand and then we can unmute you. But maybe to start us off, I have a question for you. So if a municipality is approached about a potential data center development, what do you think are the most important questions that they should be asking early on from a property assessment and taxation perspective?
Early on, it's important to establish what their long-term plans are and get them to commit a little bit more to the community. Because what we've seen in increasing structure is that you're going to have a land developer that comes in and just essentially establishes the land for power use. And then they're going to sell it as a significant markup to the next owner operator or potential user that would move in. That delays the process and that significantly inflates some land values. But then you'll have the developer that'll come in, which may or may not eventually become the owner operator down the road. They may just build it out and then sell it to another company to operate the facility. Then you're also dealing with whether it's hyperscale or co-location tenants that are moving in and uncertainty around what their level of investment, how much additional equipment they're going to bring in, and if they're even going to be able to fill out the facility. And we deal a lot of times where, yes, power is huge, power is key. A lot of companies rush to that and they start building out, but the metrics of the specific area, the amount that they would have to charge tenants or whatever it may be, just doesn't align. And then those facilities can sit vacant, leading to obsolescence and other issues until metrics shift in the favor. So the biggest thing that I would say, and what we do a lot of times, is forecast out what the 5 to 10, even 20-year commitment's going to be, what that looks like as far as value investment, what the phasing of that investment is going to be, and then really what their intentions with the site are, so that you don't get stuck with a $300 million land parcel that was originally 30 million, but it just has a little bit of power infrastructure for a data center.
Thanks. I mean, based on your slides, a lot of what you spoke about was the volatility of the financial benefits of data centers. So from a municipality standpoint, are there maybe 3 to 4 things that a municipality can do to stabilize those financial benefits?
Absolutely. The first one is going to be that incentive structure that I was talking about. We use a lot of times the pilot payments, payment in lieu or FILO. We have bond agreements, we have TIFs, we have all different types of mechanisms at our disposal to create a vehicle that can also depress the assessed value and not impact tax rates for you, but at the same time, get an influx of dollars into the community. On top of that, there's community impact payments that can be made. There's the infrastructure that I was talking about earlier. And all of these things can lead to a significant amount of benefit, I would think, in those areas.
Great. I don't see any questions yet from our participants, but I mean, I have a few more that I can ask. Data centers can represent a very large investment, both for the industry partner as well as the municipality. Does a large project value necessarily translate into that large increase in municipal tax revenue, or are there other, I think you addressed this, there were other benefits that a municipality could receive as part of this investment?
And I think that that ancillary benefit's really important because at times, and especially the way that Alberta is structured right now, with the IT being taken out of the equation and increase in AI and hyperscale, it's going to push not nearly as much investment, and there's going to be potentially some investment corners cut on the infrastructure. So the amount that's accessible, especially if a lot of that infrastructure is treated as machinery and equipment, and you're looking at more of that powered shell of just the concrete and basic connections, that's going to depress the value that's accessible and definitely lower the tax associated with that you're able to collect to the municipality. So what also needs to be brought into the equation, I think, are those community impact payments that can be negotiated ahead of time to build things, everything from new fields at schools to buying an ambulance to all these different things that communities are looking for that data centers are willing to work with you on, just like industrial manufacturing is as well, just to set that a little bit aside from the typical tax revenue. The other infrastructure improvements, I mean, we've seen it in our community as well. They improve the power lines, they improve our infrastructure. They're doing all these things. And most of the time, those aren't tax dollars paying for it. A lot of people don't realize that. Sometimes they are. But a majority of the time, that infrastructure was an agreed upon amount from the data center to be able to move into that jurisdiction. So ancillary benefit for sure.
Yeah. Looking at our participant list, I would say that the majority of the people that we have represented here today are from rural municipalities. So can you speak to the differences in terms of taxation impact or property assessment, both on the urban and the rural side?
So something that we see a lot is when this type of investment enters a jurisdiction, your market value, the cost, market value, and assessed value are going to jump. And all of a sudden, as that does jump, the tax rate is going to theoretically become depressed. Because as you have more investment, but you set your budget at X figure, you can't keep increasing that budget to keep up with a lot of these data center companies. So what that does in a lot of rural jurisdictions that don't have as much value inherent there, those municipalities are going to effectively depress the tax rate even lower. And sometimes it takes longer for council and approvals to get that tax rate back up to catch up with the investment cycle in order to get back level set with the revenue and budget they expected. So theoretically, what we see a lot of times in rural communities in the US is that a whole bunch of assessed value gets entered in, the tax goes up, but then a lot of that value drops out quickly, and the taxation associated with that building drops as well. The jurisdiction can't pump up the tax rate again quick enough to account for that revenue. And then there's a shortfall and uncertainty on that side. So a lot more on the rural side. When you're dealing with urban communities, they have much less of that as an impact. But the thing on the more urban side is that there's going to be a lot more restrictions, there's a lot more pushback. And so what we think we're seeing is that investment shift a lot more toward rural. And a lot of our data center companies, just as a side fact on this, have more or less given up on worried about weather impacts, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, whatever it may be, and are moving into a lot of different areas that may have been less ideal from a site selection process in the past. And so that's going to lead them a lot more into these rural communities. Speaking from the US perspective, again, we're seeing it on a consistent basis. You may not be as familiar, but it's when you hit the Southeast, a lot less infrastructure and development in the US when you go east of Texas. And there's not the infrastructure there to support a lot of these, but data centers are moving in anyway and building out a lot of that infrastructure. So even if you're hundreds of kilometers outside of an urban area, there's still a very good chance that they'll spend the additional money in order to be able to connect there and start establishing because the power availability can be there.
We have one question from Vulcan County. The question is, are there materials which can be provided to share with ratepayers, not specific to a particular project, but that show the benefits of the data centers?
Absolutely. Yes. I wouldn't say that we have formal marketing materials trying to convince all the jurisdictions that everything's going to be happy and wonderful. But there is a lot that we've put together to just essentially confront that misinformation. Myself, along with our credits and incentives team, will go in and meet with local jurisdictions. We'll talk to all the assessing officers. We'll talk to the community, and we present them that type of information. So there's absolutely materials we can share that are really from our perspective, but are based on the other side of the coin, where we're not talking all the negative impacts. We're just trying to get the information out about the tech changes that have been positive.
So maybe the individual that presented that question, they can reach out to our team and we'll connect you with Nathan and he can share those materials. And if anybody else would like a similar connection, please let me know. I don't see any other questions in the chat and I don't see any hands up. So Nathan, if you have, some closing statements or if we could take one lesson learned from the presentation, what would it be?
I would say that I have this conversation with many people that data centers aren't something to be afraid of. We dealt with this about 15, 20 years ago with renewable energy and a lot of credits that went out there. And I think a lot of people are slightly jaded by what happened with a lot of that sector and a lot of lost revenue that could have been accounted for on the tax side. Don't be scared of the data center moving in. Try and welcome the investment, but be cautious, like I was saying, about what that investment means and their impact to the community. You want to not only just find that significant level of expenditure that's going to be out there, but also a company that's going to be a data center supporter and also support the community to be a participant in the community. So what I really think overall is that data centers, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of ambiguity, but until we vet a lot more of that out and until we go through the process, this isn't something to be afraid of, essentially. It's just a different type of industrial property. And with new technology that's out there, sometimes those things are scary and a little bit different. So I encourage you all to look into the structure of a data center, see what's been going on in the technological advancements. Check out some of the videos that show direct-to-chip cooling and in closed loop systems that prevent any type of pollution. It's not going to say it's a perfect world out there, but it's not something that should give pause. The investment should be welcome. Otherwise, there's a very good chance that they're going to look elsewhere.
Thanks, Nathan. On behalf of the whole SouthGrow group, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us about data centers and taxation and property assessments. For those in attendance today, please watch your inboxes for next month's invitation to our Lunch and Learn. And if you have any further questions for Nathan, please reach out and we'll connect you with him. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much for the time. Have a good day.